disperse immediately or you will be subject to arrest. Do it now.
A boss ain't nothing but a thief on a time loan. 128-bit war, you play Nintendo. On some shooter, so put the bridge down. Don't feed us to the killer bees. We get what we deserve. Like bury me with my MP3s. Write my manifesto in 72 DPI. Life's just a game. You got cheated, never learned. I write these songs for every bridge that ain't been burned. For every cop car that ain't been turned.
Welcome to This is America, November 16th, 2021. On this episode, we feature a special interview with Sleydo, spokesperson for the Gidimt'en Checkpoint, about ongoing Indigenous resistance on Wet'suwet'en territory. We then switch to our discussion where we attack the recent neoliberal hot takes around the last round of elections. All this and more, but first, let's get to the news. On Wet'suwet'en territory, coastal Gaslink personnel have been given an eviction notice and pushed out of the territory. Sleydo, the spokesperson for the Gidimt'en Checkpoint, which controls access to the territory, said in a press release that Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have never ceded, surrendered, or lost title to the territory, and that coastal Gaslink employees that have been breached both Indigenous law and an eviction notice that was issued nearly 2 years ago. Check out our interview with Sleydo later in the episode for a deeper dive. In other news, a rail blockade was organized in solidarity with the ongoing Wet'suwet'en struggle, and solidarity demonstrations have also been called. White nationalist groypers, led by Unite the Right marcher, Holocaust denier, and racist troll Nick Fuentes, attempted to hold several rallies in New York City over the weekend alongside other anti-vaccine conspiracy theory groups, but faced pushback from much of the right as well as resistance from everyday New Yorkers and anti-fascists. On November 10th, a small group of groypers attempted to harass an immigrant rights rally, only to be confronted and run off by union construction workers. On Saturday night, the groypers attempted to rally but were pushed off the streets by New Yorkers throwing objects and chanting the fascists down. This type of street organizing, combined with online pressure and public education, shows how anti-fascists can work to split the fascist wing of the anti-vax movement from its wider MAGA base. As the Daily Beast wrote, an anti-vax protest outside of Pfizer's New York City's headquarters imploded on Saturday afternoon as white nationalist anti-vaxxers showed up only to be publicly shunned by the local anti-vaxxer demonstrators against vaccine mandates. The war of words erupted as the New York locals attempted to distance themselves from the ultra-racist followers of white nationalists and Unite the Right attendee Nick Fuentes. Today's organizers completely disavow infiltrators and trolls attempting to link medical freedom with extremist ideologies, namely Nick Fuentes and VaxWatch, the local group posted to their own Telegram channel. The outright rebuke apparently left a sour taste in the young white nationalist's mouth because he quickly tried to sick his followers on the rival protesters. Hashtag let him fight. It should be noted that Fox News removed a mention of the white nationalists in the article headline and its reporting after it got pushback from alt-right trolls associated with the groypers online. Tenant union members who took over a vacant unit in their apartment building in so-called Toronto and turned it into a mutual aid hub celebrated the 1-year anniversary of the project, with local school children organizing a canned food drive at their school in support. Students involved in the ongoing occupation at the HBU Blackburn University have declared victory after 34 days, with the university agreeing to meet their demands and to not retaliate against any student who had been arrested or involved in the ongoing occupation. And now for some upcoming events. On November 20th in Riverside, California, there is a Pushing Down the Walls event benefiting political prisoners. If you value What's Going Down as a revolutionary autonomous media resource in times of crisis and you have the means, please go to itsgoingdown.org/shop, sign up to donate monthly, give us a one-time donation, or donate through Bitcoin. Again, to support us, please go to itsgoingdown.org/shop. You can also tell a friend about us, sign up for our RSS feed, listen to us on the radio, follow us on social media, and also if you enjoy this show, check out other anarchist podcasts on the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. That's going to do it for us. Enjoy the interview and the discussion. We will see you soon.
This is Sleydo. I'm here on Kasiyayinta, Gidimt'en clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, and we're behind the blockade on Gidimt'en territory, where Coastal Gaslink plans to drill under Wet'suwet'en.
So maybe just to get us started, I think a lot of people have seen the recent arrests, and there's a lot of kind of moving pieces to everything. Can you just tell us kind of give us an overview of everything that's happening right now?
Sure. So we've been here for 48 days now. We're on a main access road to the drill pad site. The access road is blocked so that Coastal Gaslink can't come in and drill under our sacred headwaters. In the first few days of the occupation, there was a lot of police presence. There were 2 arrests that were made. The RCMP and CIRG, the Community Industry Response Group, specialized RCMP to deal with Indigenous land offenders, came in and was coming in almost daily into the camp and sabotaging things and being violent with people and threatening everybody with arrest. And so probably a couple of weeks after that, some friends and allies showed up and were able to chase the RCMP out of the territory. They hadn't tried to come back again until about a week ago, and they were escorted out of the area once again. And so we're able to hold the police presence from coming into the territory. They're patrolling on the main road and in other parts of the territory, but currently we're holding this space. It's been 48 days now, and with no police in camp at all. So things are going really well.
Can you tell us a little more about, you said there's a special unit within the RCMP that's developed just to deal with Indigenous land defense struggles. Our understanding is that this is the same police unit that was also at the ongoing resistance at Fairy Creek against the logging there. Is that true?
Yes, that's true. Yeah, so this detachment or this unit of the RCMP has actually been the one that created detachment on our territory after 2019. And so they have a detachment on Gidimt'en territory that they had been operating out of and had full-time 24-hour staff patrolling and harassing and surveilling people for about a year and a half. And then once the Fairy Creek blockade happened and that resistance started heating up, a lot of the CIRG were called to that action. And so they've had a limited presence in our territory since that time. And so it seems like now there's this divide where they can't be in 2 places at once, and they don't have enough officers to enforce both struggles at the same time. And so a lot of the CIRG are still down at Fairy Creek.
We've seen online that they have built a man camp on the territory. Can you talk about that and also how people are dealing with that construction?
Yeah, so there's actually 3 man camps, or 4 man camps on Wet'suwet'en territory. There's 2 that are up past Cassia territory, and so they're not on Gidimt'en territory. They're way back in the territories, close to the mountain ranges where they're trying to blast through the mountain to get over to Kitimat, to the coast. There's another man camp over on one of the other Gidimt'en territories near us, neighboring us. And there's another one in Burns Lake. So some of them are fully operational with, several hundred people employed. It's been really intense with all the conflicts happening. Some of the CGL workers are getting licked and becoming so things have been heating up a little bit in this area, and they've actually been blocking the roads themselves with their heavy machinery in order to Wet'suwet'en people out of the territory.
What do you see as the next moves? Like, what do you see happening in the coming weeks?
Well, we're going to continue to hold our ground here, and I think for people to know that the eviction order that happened by the hereditary chiefs in January of 2020 on January 4th, the hereditary chiefs evicted coastal Gaslink from the territory. All of the letter and were in attendance and evicted them off of the territory. An order still stands and is being enforced by the Wet'suwet'en. So that's a really important thing that people should know and understand, that just because things have been quiet for the last year because of COVID, that eviction still needs to be upheld, and that eviction needs to be enforced by Wet'suwet'en people on the ground, and it will continue to be enforced.
Do you feel that the intense amount of resistance that happened the last couple of years, across Canada, there was lots of articles written just talking about the massive impact to the so-called Canadian economy. Do you feel like that drastically changed the way that the state is sort of dealing with this thing, or did that make them change their tactics a lot, or?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Those actions and how widespread they were and how effective they were at crippling the Canadian economy, I think is a real threat to the state. And so they're calculating every move that they make. Coastal GasLink can't afford to have another big conflict in terms of their investors and their timelines and their budgets and all of those kinds of things. But also, the government can't afford to have another shutdown Canada, and that's exactly what's going to happen if our CMP try to come in here and remove Wet'suwet'en people from their land again at gunpoint.
From people that are just kind of like watching this play out online, the brutality of the police seems very clear, especially like when we also see other like land defense struggles, how they're being repressed. I'm just curious though, on the other end, and the Canadian state seems to be kind of like Trudeau is very known for like, trying to speak to concerns and kind of like recuperate all these things in a very neoliberal way. I'm just curious, is that another aspect of how the state is trying to address this, trying to like appease certain people and go about it in like a softer way while the police are also being very brutal at the same time?
Yeah, I think that definitely, anybody who's following along, and we obviously can see very clearly that Trudeau and all the levels of government are, they're paying huge lip service to reconciliation and to Indigenous rights and to the rule of law and all of those kinds of things. But on the ground, we know that none of that applies here. It doesn't apply to Indigenous people. It doesn't apply to Wet'suwet'en people or anybody trying to defend the land or anybody supporting those who are trying to defend the land. And so it's very clear that they are not following their own rule of law. We uphold Wet'suwet'en law, and all of our guests on our territory uphold Wet'suwet'en law. But we know and can see right through Justin Trudeau's lip service of, Indigenous rights and respecting Indigenous people, because our CMP are coming in and brutalizing people and have used tasers and have used torture just within the last 48 days here on Wet'suwet'en territory.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts or messages for folks that may be facing certain charges. I know both in the so-called United States and in Canada, there are people that are facing pretty heavy charges stemming from the last couple of years of solidarity actions. I'm just wondering if you have anything that you'd want to express to them.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, want to express my gratitude for everybody who is standing up against the state. I think that all of our struggles and our worldviews and our values are similar, whether it's Indigenous sovereignty or the repression of the state, the colonial state, capitalism, and all of the fallout of all of those things. I think that they're all really connected, and that people have replied to that call to action to take an active and aggressive approach to challenging the state in the way that they're behaving and the way that they're treating Indigenous people and the environment. And so, I have the deepest and utmost respect for everybody who has sacrificed and everybody who's continuing to sacrifice, their freedom, their livelihoods, their families, to be on the front lines and to support us in this struggle. And I think that, the state is coming down really hard on people because it's a real threat. We're a real threat when we act together and we act in solidarity with each other. When we shut down Canada in the way that we did, that's a real threat to the state, and they know it, so that they're trying to repress people even further. And I think that when those kinds of situations happen and when those opportunities arise, that it's an opportunity and a call to us to push even harder, because we know we're making a difference.
Well, just kind of like one other big overarching question. I'm sure you saw this, but there was recently an article that was published that talked about just the massive impact that Indigenous land defense struggles are having on the fossil fuel industry. And, with the COP26 recently happening, and there's still a lot of hope, it seems like, within certain movements around different governments and corporations, kind of reining in the fossil fuel industry. And you all have just been on the front lines and had such a massive impact on fighting back against all of these pipeline projects. I'm curious, what you would say maybe to other people that are still having hope in the governments and the corporations themselves being able to regulate their own industries and actions.
I think that the work that people are doing is important in all different areas. I do believe that direct action and occupation are what force those corporations and the governments to take action. I don't believe that they're going to do it based on the fact that it's the right thing to do. I think that the action that people are taking on the ground is what's forcing the hand, and we need to continue to do that, and we need to be creative and do it in new ways and push the envelope even further than we already have, because we're on the right track. We're winning this fight, and we just have to push harder and keep going and keep making those relationships and those bonds with different groups and different accomplices, and make sure that we're all united in this fight.
Well, for those that are listening and want to support, what are some ways that people can both keep up with what's going on and also take action and solidarity or offer material support?
So we have a website, yintoaccess.com, and that has all of our social media handles and all of our videos and our updates that people can follow along. I encourage people to, first and foremost, come to the INTA, to come here if they can, to be a part of this, time in our history that real change is happening, and that we have this amazing opportunity to see significant change and to take the action that has been, it has been brewing for years, for generations. I think that now is the time that Indigenous folks and other groups and organizations of groups that can come together and really make a significant difference. And so I'm calling on everybody to come to the INTA and see for themselves exactly what we're fighting for and exactly how we operate and exactly what we can do together. If people can't come, I encourage people to take action where they are. There's been some amazing solidarity actions all across so-called Canada and so-called United States and around the world that have been, we've been watching and we've been seeing how people are operating, and it's absolutely inspiring. And so I encourage more of that to happen. I don't think that we should wait until there's a big raid in Wet'suwet'en territory again. We need to take advantage of the fact that we are winning now, and we got to push it as far as we can right now.
Anything else you'd like to say?
I think that there's a huge opportunity here that has been, we've seen it happening, this relationship and this allyship between Indigenous warriors and anarchists that has been developing over the years. And I think that combining those two groups particularly is a really powerful move against the state and a really powerful voice that we can have together. And so I just want to encourage people to act on that and encourage people to think about that and how we can make huge differences, acting together and doing direct action as a collective and in solidarity with one another.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Look, Black Lives Matter, dog. You can see rainy weather, and the only way we gon' make it out is if we stick together. Black Lives Matter, dog. You can see rainy weather, and the only way we gon' make it out is if we stick together. They tryna get rid of my people, they treating us like we ain't equal. My panthers out here moving lethal. I feel like I'm Stevie Wonder, niggas see through. Niggas, they watching your moves, wanna be you. Brody, he play with the keys like the Beatles. We making scenes just wait for the next sequel. The police, they killing the black, we ain't equal. And they kill Rex for what? They ain't even had no reason. Martin Luther King had a dream to get us all on one mission. And ever since way back then, we been on one mission. Malcolm X had sticks out, he was on a mission. And for Judge Floyd, we all went to war, cause they ain't had no reason. They ain't tried to treat us like slaves, they don't got no reason. But we ain't going out like that. Back then, we ain't have shoes or no clothes on our back. Back then, ain't have a bed, we had to sleep on the mat. Back then, we had it the worst way. Back then, had it the worst way. Back then, they was treating us like we was slaves. Back then, they was treating us like we was slaves. Dog, you can see rainy weather, and the only way we gon' make it out is if we stick together. Black Lives Matter, dog, you can see rainy weather, and the only way we gon' make it out is if we stick together.
Okay, we're here to discuss the news once again. There's been a wave of elections, supposedly. We're going to comment on those. We're going to break them apart, dissect them, talk about them, and also, moreover, talk about what people are inferring from them. Every time there's an election and the Republicans get in, there's always this discussion about what does it mean for the left? What does it mean for either groups that are promoting electoralism, or what does it mean for the country in general? So far, what we've seen a lot of is that this is a referendum on Biden, or that it's a referendum on progressive wing of the Democratic Party, supposedly, or this obsession within the Democrats, supposedly, with identity politics. I mean, we could take that in a variety of ways, post George Floyd. And the Democrats need to return to some sort of bread and butter rush back to the center, supposedly, instead of these crazy, far out there, far left ideas. We're going to kind of attack all of those positions and look at what's really going on. But real quick, what happened this week?
Yeah, so there was this big question going into these kind of off-year elections, right? So, I mean, probably most of you didn't even know that there was an election happening where you live. If you don't live in a big city, right? In big cities, these kinds of elections are often for things like mayor, city council, right? So they tend to get some play. And there were kind of two things that were going on here. First is there were a number of cities, Seattle, Minneapolis, Cleveland, a few others that had sort of usually charter amendments to the city charter, sometimes just kind of legal proposals that were getting voted on under referendum, to either significantly change the way that accountability happens for police, or to create a process for cutting police funding, or both. Now, in a lot of those cases, in fact, in every single case, I think, except Cleveland, all of those bills lost. Cleveland won in that election, right? But that was kind of one of these big questions, is like, how far were voters going to go around the defund the police question? And I can talk about why those bills failing in a place like Minneapolis doesn't necessarily mean what people are taking away from it, but we can get to that in a second. The other thing that happened was that there were a number of these kind of high-profile, highly politicized elections, right? A couple of governorships, specifically Virginia and New Jersey, lots of like local school board elections that got all wrapped up in this like, literal fantasy about critical race theory. Things like this, right? And so a lot of people were looking at this and kind of seeing it as an indication or a bellwether of sort of where we are at the moment, sort of a year-ish into the Biden administration.
So what are the hot takes that we're hearing right now from folks?
Yeah.
What is the spectacle really saying about these elections, and what do they kind of like want to advance with these talking points?
Yeah, so I think first thing I want to do is I want to break these out. I want to talk about the question about the police, and then the bigger, broader sort of like, this is where political dynamics are and what people are saying about that. Because on some level, they're different questions. On some level, they're the same question, or at least the pundits are treating it as the same question, right? So on this local level, again, all of these referendums failed except the one in Cleveland. I think all of them. And most progressive candidates lost their mayoral elections, again, except for Cleveland, right? And so there's kind of this take out in the media right now that, the movement against the police failed, and all of these voters turned up to reject the defund the police agenda, and blah, 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 blah. And it's true. In a lot of cities, moderate candidates, even moderate candidates of the same party as their opponent, were using Republican talking points, and they were saying, this person wants to defund the police, blah, 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 right? Now, there's a number of things to keep in mind here, though, that are really important. First is we have to take into account local political dynamics. So let's take Buffalo as an example. Buffalo is kind of one of these cities that's being held up as an example of the left losing, right? Because in the primaries, this DSA member, I'm forgetting her name off the top of my head, was able to win the Democratic Party primary. And in the process, sort of potentially unseat a mayor which has been in power for, I think, like 12 years or something like that. And this mayor is a very moderate Democrat. Now, that mayor then ran a write-in campaign and won, pretty handily, actually, by a wide, significant margin. And everyone's looking at that and saying, oh, well, that's a rejection of the DSA's, like, left-wing politics. But we have to keep a lot of things in mind. Like, there's tons of caveats with stuff like this. So let's take Buffalo, for example. Voter turnout in Rust Belt cities and off-year elections is really low. And the people that tend to show up for these things are people that have some connections or some stake in the power structure, which in a lot of Rust Belt cities, including the one I live in, is not most people. These elections tend to have 1/3 to half the turnout that even a midterm election has, right? And so we're really talking about a small sliver of the city's population kind of making these decisions. Now, in some of these cities, specifically in Cleveland and a couple of other medium-sized cities, voter turnout was way up, and those were the places where these things succeeded. When voter turnout stayed relatively moderate, in most cases, that's where things lost. Now, Minneapolis, I think, is the exception to this, right? So we have that dynamic to keep in mind. Most people don't participate in these things. And so we're really looking at, in most places, a very small sliver of the population making a decision. And a small sliver of the population that feels connected to the political system, and a lot of those people are pro-police, right? You'd have to be connected to the political system. The second thing to keep in mind with a city like Buffalo is you take Buffalo in the context of the rest of Rust Belt cities, and Buffalo is historically deeply conservative. It's whiter than a lot of other Rust Belt cities, and it's a lot more Catholic than a lot of other Rust Belt cities, right? And so the idea that a socialist was going to become mayor of Buffalo was sort of this like weird anomaly in history, right? Like they had a socialist mayor like 100 years ago, but so did a lot of Rust Belt cities, right? That's not new. The idea that Buffalo would elect a socialist over a moderate Democrat, when that primary happened, it was almost unbelievable. It was almost a fantasy world. And a lot of people were saying that at the time. What that was, what we saw yesterday in Buffalo, was a return back to their political normality. Like, that is the standard politics of people who actually participate in city politics in Buffalo, is that they tend to be moderate Democrats, right? That's not new. So it's not like there's a huge political shift that happened there, right? The status quo stayed. And that was very likely always going to be true, right? You take Seattle, right? Seattle is a city which is rapidly gentrifying. And even though there was a very militant movement against the police there, a lot of the people that live in Seattle have a lot of things that they think that they need to rely on the police to, quote, protect, right? There's a lot of gentrifiers. There's a lot of yuppies in Seattle. There's a lot of tech companies, right? All of those constituencies tend to be really militantly pro-police. And so it's, again, not a huge surprise that in a citywide election, the progressive lost. I mean, I think a lot of us think of Seattle as this very left-wing city, and there are definitely elements of that there for sure, right? But again, it is a gentrifying city, and if we look at gentrifying cities in general, not just Seattle, but if we look at gentrifying cities in general, as gentrification happens, politics tend to get more moderate. That's generally the trend, and we can see that in New York, right? We can see that in other cities as well. Ted Wheeler in Portland is a good example of this, right? Jacob Fry in Minneapolis is a good example of this, which Minneapolis is a city that's also experienced gentrification. So we can't just think of these things as like neutral indicators, right? We have to think of these things in the context of local politics. And when you think about them that way, all of these results actually make a ton of sense and don't really indicate huge shifts like people think they do.
Well, also it's, the party is turning largely on like these outlier progressive candidates that have connections maybe to the DSA or whatever. Like, for instance, you brought up the situation in Buffalo. I'm reading that the person that replaced Andrew Cuomo refused to support them and basically gave their blessing to the write-in candidate, the one who won. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's no surprise then that, like, when the establishment where all the money is backs a certain candidate, a lot of people are going to go for that. Apparently, a lot of the major unions in the area back that candidate as well, as opposed to the DSA-backed person, which again doesn't surprise me at all because so much of the union leadership, not the rank and file though, but the union leadership itself, of course, is in bed with the Democratic Party. I mean, this is one of the problems why unions have atrophied and become essentially this either labor brokeraging firm, something that survives only to collect dues, and also create, a symbiotic relationship with the Democratic Party, which is is designed to manage class struggle, keep it in this basically back boardroom thing so it doesn't break out, and essentially manage austerity and the lowering of wages so people don't get out of control.
Yeah, well, and so let's talk about the exception. Like, let's talk about what happened in Cleveland and why that happened that way. There's a lot of things to keep in mind. Cleveland is the poorest major city in America, right? It's also one of the most violent major cities in America. It's also a city which has been dominated by the Democratic Party for generations, and specifically a very moderate wing of the Democratic Party. For a very long time, it's also been a city which is typified by incredibly low levels of political participation. But keep in mind, 7 years ago, the police murdered a 12-year-old in Cleveland. And people have been out in the streets in that city on and off for 7 years now. And when a group of people is out in the streets for that long and they're able to pull, in late May in Cleveland, there were like 5,000 people out in the streets in a city of 450,000, right? And the rioting and the looting there was really intense. And that all is a result of 7 years of organizing work and hard work on the ground and shifts in the sort of discourse there. Those shifts weren't necessarily new positions. Those shifts were that the social movements in the city were able to give voice to positions that people were not otherwise comfortable articulating in public. Because one of the things that typifies a city like Cleveland or Chicago is that politicians and police retaliate. And so in places like that, historically, people are less likely to be honest about what their real political positions are. when social movements break out in places like that, there's often a level of surprise in the media about how militant and how radical they are. Because it doesn't seem like that's what's happening, because when journalists go talk to people, they hear these really moderate things, right? But really on the ground, the reality is very different. And so even there, what happened is not really a surprise at all. You also have to keep in mind that just before this, in that area, there was a primary race for a U.S. House seat because the former House rep for that area, Marcia Fudge, became the head of HUD under Joe Biden. That House seat has been essentially controlled by Democrats for as long as the House seat has existed, and specifically has a history of relatively progressive Democrats holding that seat. And this time around, the chairwoman of the Cuyahoga County Democratic Party, who's named Shontel Brown, who is now a new U.S. House rep, was able to mobilize a bunch of Republican donors and conservative talking points to win a primary against a socialist candidate, like an openly socialist candidate. If you look at how that vote total broke down, though, and I was looking at this last night, trying to understand what happened there. If you look at the vote totals, though, in the city of Cleveland, the socialist candidate won overwhelmingly. It was the suburbs that pushed the moderate. And so that really is one of these things which is a clear indicator of what was about to happen yesterday, and why it's not a surprise. And so all of these journalists, and God, there's been like 800 editorials about this today, are saying things like, oh, well, everything that happened in the uprising last year is worthless. Everyone chose moderate politics because of danger and violence and so on, so on. There's nothing to indicate that that's true. Literally nothing. If you want to make the claim that 20% of a city is able to express, like, 20% of a city which is very specifically attached to the political system feels the ability to express the will of the whole city, then sure, yeah, those people were never down with getting rid of the police to begin with. And so we can't take a bunch of moderate liberals voting for moderate liberals as an indicator that anything has changed. Because in the cities where the voter turnout shifted, those things won. And that's the important indicator, actually. Like, if you really look at a place like Cleveland, where voter turnout was up and the demographics of people that showed up changed, shifted, became poorer and less white, those initiatives won and those candidates won. Right? That's the important story here. It's not that defunding the police failed in Seattle and Minneapolis and places like that. There was already pushback there. And those are already areas in which, again, political participation tends to be confined to people that are more moderate. The real indicators is where a change has happened. An actual change has happened. And that has happened on the heels of less wealthy, less white voters showing up and pushing positions that are against the continuation of policing as it exists. That's the important indication.
So what do we make of the claim that the Republicans winning in some areas is basically a reflection of the Democrats' failure to govern, quote unquote, or their inability to pass like the Build Back Better Act, which is, this package of legislation and, investing, quote unquote, in human infrastructure that they've really been pushing and fighting with not only people in their own party, but also the Republicans. What do we make of that claim?
This is another claim which is incredibly thinly sourced. Really, a lot of this claim centers around three things. First are local school board elections. The second is the gubernatorial election in New Jersey. And the third is the gubernatorial election in Virginia, which is really the one that everyone's focusing on. So let's take school board elections first, because in reality, sure, some random conservatives won school board seats in places that they wouldn't have otherwise won. We have to also keep in mind that a lot of school board seats are open and people don't really run against people. And if people do run against people, they're not really running against known other people. School board elections are always this kind of weird backwater in which fringy political candidates can always gain positions. And the number of roles that they actually gained were incredibly small, given the fact that Steve Bannon was essentially giving them free advertising on his podcast for like 6 months, right? That in a lot of places where they tried to actually really run campaigns hard, they failed. And they failed very specifically in suburbs, which is a really important indication because, again, Trump lost in 2020 by roughly the same margin that suburbanites shifted their votes. And so when the right wing mounts a concerted campaign with funding and AstroTurf organizations and whole news networks like Fox News essentially pushing a certain political line that is sort of in line with that, and they still don't win, that's something that's important. And again, it indicates the opposite of what a lot of these pundits are saying. They're saying, oh, some QAnon people won an, school board seat in a suburb outside of Detroit. I mean, I don't know if it was Detroit, but suburbs outside of cities. Okay, cool. There were like 2 candidates and one barely ran a campaign. Or this place has already elected some fringy people. Or there's 20 people on the school board and this is one person. Right? That is not an indication of a huge political shift. The fact that they failed to win as many seats as they did in suburban areas with all the funding and all the support that they had, that's the indicator. That's the important thing. They were able to swing almost no voters in their direction. None. And in the places where they did win 1 or 2 seats in suburbs, if you go and really look at those places, and I kind of did a sample kind of spot check with some of these places around the country that were getting mentioned in news articles, these are usually suburbs which are outer ring suburbs that tend to be wealthier and tend to be more conservative already anyways. So it's not like QAnon people are winning school board seats in city school boards or even entering suburban school boards. They're winning them in far-flung, far out, already wealthy, mostly white suburbs, which is not a surprise at all. That doesn't change literally anything about the analysis that people have had for the last year. Nothing. It literally is a replay of everything that we've been saying. Not just us, but like Politico. Even people at Huffington Post, right, have been saying this kind of stuff for a year already. And that doesn't change. So, okay, we can't use that as an indication. We can't use New Jersey as an indication because, literally right before we started recording this, it was announced that the Democrat won. So we can't use that. So all we have left is now Virginia. Virginia is the literal only example that moderate Democrats have to hang this argument on is Virginia. So let's talk about Virginia because Virginia is a very special place politically. A number of things to keep in mind. First, I want to talk about there's general dynamics in Virginia. Then there's the very specific dynamics of Terry Mcauliffe, the Democratic candidate, and his role in the Democratic Party and his role in pushing the Democratic Party to the center over the last 30 years. But to start, Virginia in general is a very politically complicated state. There are a lot of people that live in Virginia that are not citizens of the state, that live in the DC metro area, that maintain temporary residences. There is a lot of money in the northern part of the state, again, the DC metro area, and the DC metro area tends to be very, very liberal. Very, very liberal. But then you have the rest of the state. And sure, in Virginia, you've got Richmond, right? Newport News, Charlottesville, right? Like these are liberal outposts and every state has those. But Virginia was also the capital of the Confederacy. And I think a lot of us forget that. Like we look at, Prince George's County right outside DC, or we look at Richmond, which is kind of like hipstery and cool. Or we look at Charlottesville, which is like a liberal college town. And we forget that the rest of the state of Virginia, which is very large, is actually deeply conservative. Deeply, deeply conservative. And has been for a long, long time. And so in Virginia, elections are swung by really thin margins a lot of times when they're on a state level. And what that leads to is a really interesting dynamic, which is that politics in Virginia tend to be really tied in with whatever's going on in DC. And that's because of, bordering the district. But one of the things that tends to happen in Virginia is when there is a gubernatorial election in Virginia, I forget how long it's been decades at least, 60 or 70 years. Only one time has the candidate from the party that was in power in Washington won a gubernatorial race in Virginia. Every other time, the opposition party wins. That's a lot of gubernatorial races. If it's 6 years, that's at least 15 of them. And in 14 of them, the opposition party has won. So whatever party's in the White House, the other party wins the governorship in Virginia. The vast majority of the time. So the fact that the Republican won is not that surprising. Because that's actually historically what should be expected in Virginia. Right? Virginia, again, is deeply, deeply conservative. And yeah, there were a lot of really messed up parts of the Youngkin campaign, the guy who won, specifically around racism. But again, Virginia was the heart of the Confederacy, literally. And it's not entirely surprising that, say, running an entire gubernatorial campaign based on banning critical race theory from schools would work there. I mean, you also have to remember some of the governors of Virginia that they've had in the past are kind of the precursors of kind of Trumpian politics, right? Ken Cuccinelli, for example, who ended up being one of the higher ups at the Department of Homeland Security under Trump, right? So again, there is a conservative streak in Virginia that is very almost invisible to a lot of people that live outside of Virginia. I know, like, I live in the north in a Rust Belt city. That's not something I would know or have any awareness of if this wasn't something I followed and studied, right? And so that dynamic is in play. And Trump is in play. And Trump showed up in Virginia to campaign for this guy. And, you know, all this outside money poured in to run ads, and all these super PACs showed up. And, you know, for the Republicans, this race was really important. Because for them, they had to win. Not just because of the political history of Virginia, but they had to, in some way, find some race that they could use to make the claim that Joe Biden's agenda is, quote, failing. Right? And that everyone knows it, and the country is falling into the pits of hell, right? Which is what you hear on Fox News all the time. They have to prove that somehow. And so winning that gubernatorial race became really important for them, like almost irrationally important for them. So there was a quip, Terry Mcauliffe during one of the debates, said something snarky, and I forget what it was, but for whatever reason, it became kind of a cause on the right wing. And it was after that the Youngkin campaign pulled ahead. That before that, Mcauliffe was winning. And so, again, really thin margins in Virginia, like really, really thin margins. But those thin margins tend to swing in the direction that they swung yesterday. Like, that's not anomalous at all. I forget who it was. I think it was someone in Politico pointed this out. It was a whole article about how the media is way overreacting to what happened in Virginia. That it's not necessarily an indication that Virginians rejected the Biden agenda or something like that, or that they're accepting Trumpism or something. It's really it's more grounded in kind of political history and sort of the political tendencies that have built up in Virginia over the last couple of years. Remember, under the most recent governor, the right wing in Virginia really mobilized hard around gun rights stuff. And there were those massive rallies in Virginia, armed rallies in Virginia, that happened like 3-4 years ago. And I'd actually forgotten about those until about a week ago when I started looking into this campaign specifically. And a lot of the people that were involved in the grassroots organizing around this campaign for the Republicans were people that were involved in organizing those rallies, right? Like, it's not, again, this is not that surprising. Like, it's not surprising. But there's another thing that's in play here, and this is probably the more important thing, and this is actually where I want to focus a lot of attention tonight. We have to talk about who Terry Mcauliffe is. So, Terry Mcauliffe, who was a Democratic candidate for governor, had been the governor before. I think 8 years ago or something like that, he was the governor. But before that, Terry Mcauliffe was a person that is and was deeply involved in the Democratic Leadership Council. So for people that don't know, the DLC is a faction of the Democratic Party that got built up under Bill Clinton in the early 90s. I mean, some people trace its roots back to the late 80s. But they really kind of consolidated during that period of time. And they made this argument where they said, Americans are getting more conservative. We can see that. They voted for Reagan. They're getting more conservative. So therefore we need to get more conservative. And, progressive candidates will always lose because Americans are conservative. Okay? I'll get into the problems with that position in a second, but I want to go through the history first. So he comes out of those roots and rose up through the ranks of the Democratic Party, ultimately to become the chairperson of the Democratic Party, by allying himself with the Clintons, very specifically. What that means is that he allied himself with things like cutting social spending, balancing the federal budget, increasing the size of the military, engaging in neoliberal globalization, so on, so on, so on. And that has been his politics ever since. So there's something really odd about this argument that they're making, right? This argument is kind of cropping up, which moderate Democrats are starting to say, well, look, Terry McAuliffe lost. So if he lost, obviously he lost because people are rejecting progressive Democrats. Obviously. There is absolutely no foundation for that conclusion. Absolutely none. Let's break this argument down a bit. They're trying to say that Terry McAuliffe, who is not only a moderate Democrat, but literally instrumental in creating the faction of moderate Democrats, lost because of progressives. That does not make any sense. So we have to really get into why that happened. Let's actually dive into a bit of why McAuliffe lost yesterday, because he was sort of on the way to winning. Not really in an anointed sense, but he very likely was going to win the election. But his campaign, for all intents and purposes, for anyone all political analysts that kind of were aware of the campaign and maybe in contact with people in the campaign, was horrendously run. It was terrible. They ran the entire campaign about Donald Trump. Which, sure, lots of people hate Donald Trump. But that's all they talked about. They said, Glenn Youngkin is Donald Trump. So you shouldn't vote for him because he's Donald Trump. And so he comes out and goes, yeah, but this is where me and Trump differ. Because he's at least coming out of not really the super right wing of the Republican Party in Virginia. He's kind of coming out of the middle right? So more conservative than the moderates, but definitely not originally out of the MAGA crowd. He used to be a hedge fund manager, right? And so he ran his whole campaign on this idea that he's just a normal suburban dad that's really concerned about politics. And he barely, until the very end, talked about Terry McAuliffe at all. He was saying, look, I'm just this guy. That guy is a creature of the Democratic Party political machine, which is true. That's not a lie. That is absolutely true. Now, the Youngkin campaign lied about a bunch of other stuff. And about 3 months ago, they got really racist with everything. But at least the claim that Terry McAuliffe is deeply tied in with big business interests and sort of, financial institutions and pharmaceutical companies and things like that is not wrong. He absolutely 1,000% is. And so then we have to start to think about okay, well, what do people in Virginia or nationally even think about progressive policies? Because obviously if progressive policies are the thing that cost Terry McAuliffe the election, and I'm not, I'm not diving into this because that's a game-changing thing. I'm diving into this because this does say a lot about our political dynamics. If you really dive into progressive policies, just take the policies that were proposed in the Build Back Better plan, all of which have been shot down by Joe Manchin, very specifically. Those included things like improving roads, universal pre-K, free community college, student loan relief, blah, 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 jobs programs. All of those, in every poll done, are widely popular. And when I mean widely popular, I mean 60% approval ratings. 60%. What that means is that Trump supporters support those policies, which is not actually all that surprising. Because this whole position that moderates lose because of progressives is grounded in one basic fundamental fallacy. And that fundamental fallacy is that Americans are consistent with their politics. Right? We have this idea that, moderates, quote, moderates win because most Americans are, quote, moderates, because most Americans are independents. We talked a little bit about this around election time, but it's really interesting in this context. But that's not actually true. If you actually look at Americans' political positions, often they're entirely incoherent, right? They contradict each other a lot of the time. People will say things like, yeah, sure, I'm in support of business, but I really don't like globalization. Or, I really support people's ability to make money, but I totally want billionaires to pay like 80% of their income in taxes, right? Like these positions that just do not work together. But people hold them in their heads at the same time, pretty consistently. And to be really honest, if we're to really dive into that a bit, that's what the Trump campaign did really well. I think it's really easy to just think that the Trump campaign did only completely inept things. But at least the 2016 campaign that he ran was really smart in this regard, right? He didn't mean any of it. He didn't mean a word of it. But what he did was he went out into, communities like Youngstown, Ohio, which is like pretty notoriously a Democratic Party stronghold that did vote for Trump in 2016 and was kind of held up in the media as like the example, right? The Youngstown area is an area that's been absolutely gutted by capitalism. It makes bigger Rust Belt cities look, luxurious in comparison. I mean, it is, I've been there. It's bad. It's really bad. And the areas outside of those cities, like Youngstown, are really deeply conservative. And so, if you go into Youngstown, though, not only did Trump win in 2016, so did Tim Ryan, who is like a pro-labor Democrat. And like really notoriously so, a pro-labor Democrat, like pro-universal healthcare, pro-labor Democrat, right? Pretty in the mold of like Rust Belt kind of center to progressive kind of Democrats, right? He also won. And so if you look at what's in common between those two, both of them talked about jobs programs. Both of them talked about infrastructure. Both of them talked about universal pre-K. Both of them talked about figuring out some way to make college more affordable. Now, Trump didn't mean any of it. He was saying this because it was polling popularly. But he won on that message. I think a lot of us want to write off Trump's election as purely racism. And sure, there was a lot of that. Absolutely. I would never deny that. However, that's not why every person voted for him. And a lot of people did vote for him based on the idea that he was going to enact what otherwise are progressive Democratic Party policies. You look at the policies that Joe Manchin very specifically shut down in the infrastructure bill. Every single one of those polls at 60% or better. So, let's break all that down for a second. We have a moderate Democrat who is literally the poster child of moderate Democrats, running in an election where he lost in a state which pretty routinely votes for the opposition party and has a deeply conservative streak, and all of the policies that he rejected that are progressive policies are popular. So if we add all that up, the conclusion that you draw from that is not progressive Democrats cost moderates elections. The conclusion that one would draw from that, if they were engaging in a good faith argument, would be that moderate policies actually cost Democrats elections. And we can see that borne out in the actual voter turnouts and enthusiasm numbers. So, voter turnout amongst Democrats in Virginia was way down yesterday, during the election yesterday. When asked why, people said that they did not care for or were not inspired by anything that Terry Mcauliffe had to say about anything. That does not sound like a bunch of people being like, oh, identity politics and progressives. It sounds like a lot of people being like, yo, you all compromise so much that you essentially just don't have any politics anymore.
Right. And I mean, I think this gets to the more interesting discussion, and let's talk about this for a bit. But I mean, as we've said before, the only reason that people really vote for Democrats now is not because they're like offering
Not
up these like,
Republicans?
they're not Trump. I mean,
Yeah.
there was recently an interesting article that just came out that's been making the rounds. It says young people's ambivalent relationship with political parties. 56% of young people ages 18 to 24 choose to affiliate with the Democrat or Republican parties. And this is interesting. This is at the same time when about, half of millennials and Zoomers, are associating themselves with anti-capitalist ideas, whether it's socialism or anarchism. There was a recent poll that we've talked a lot about, which I find fascinating. 2 out of 10 young African American folks believe that revolution is the best way to change society. I mean, across the board racially, it's about the same level in other racial categories as well. We had tens of millions of people participate in the Black Lives Matter uprising over last summer. I mean, none of this stuff has changed. I mean, inequality is now at, near Gilded Age level, post-pandemic. None of this stuff has gotten better. Biden has not made any of this better. And as we've seen, there's been massive things that have happened that I think have really cut away at this kind of veneer that we had going into the Biden administration that like, oh, people are going to hold his feet to the fire, or that there's enough progressive strength to basically like create this wedge within the administration that's going to change things. None of that has happened. I mean, look what we've seen. We've seen, the Build Back Better Act just be completely gutted. And this is just, piecemeal basic stuff. Yeah. We've seen the response to climate change be, catastrophic. I mean, they're investing more money in fossil fuels, over the next decade, not less. I mean, Biden has already pushed for more offshore drilling. Not only that, but look at the debacle at the border with people that were migrating here from Haiti. Look how they handled that. How disgusting that was. I mean, we saw the most horrific images that many people have seen in the last couple of years under Biden's watch. And this is after a massive uprising over white supremacy in this country. And I think a lot of people, again, realize that both parties represent largely a lot of the same things, except the Republicans realize that their show is kind of going to be ending soon, and they're gravitating towards this anti-democratic, sentiment, open fascism, because they know that their numbers are dwindling and they have to basically hold on to power through anti-democratic means. You're listening to It's Going Down, part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. Follow us online at itsgoingdown.org and on Twitter at IGD_news. If you like and appreciate this podcast, go to itsgoingdown.org/shop and give us a one-time donation. Sign up to donate monthly or donate through Bitcoin. Again, that's itsgoingdown.org/shop to support. And now, back to the show.
Yeah, well, and I think that's actually the really important takeaway here, which is increasingly elections don't tell us anything about politics anymore. And they haven't for a while, actually. Part of the reason that that's true is that moderates have been able to sort of dominate electoral politics for so long that they've been able to say, yeah, well, but the left will never win, so we have to have this moderate, right? And then they sabotage left-wing campaigns. And we have proof of that. I mean, like, the WikiLeaks dumps in 2016 literally proved that. Like, there were emails from Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who at the time was the head of the Democratic Party, openly conspiring against the Sanders campaign. Right? So, like, we know that's true. Anyone that lives in a political machine city also has seen this, right? And so, essentially what they do is they say, all right, well, we're never going to try the counter option. We're just going to do this, and then we're going to insist it's the only thing that's possible. The result of that has been interesting, because the result of that has not been what it was for, say, Generation X, which a lot of them did vote moderate and continue to do so. That's not what happened with millennials, though, and with Zoomers. What happened with us is we showed up in the streets instead.
Yeah.
Like, we hit the ground, we did the thing for real. And didn't worry about the political parties.
One of the things I think people need to realize, what is changing though, is that the political structure, especially with the Democrats, while the Republicans, they've embraced, out there QAnon stuff, adrenochrome, Democrats are pedophiles, so on and so forth. They've embraced that full-heartedly because ultimately the reason is because they can do that, and it's not going to upset power. It's not going to upset capital. I mean, people that believe that Democrats are satanic Antifa, BLM, elites that are going to kill their kids and suck their blood. That's not going to disrupt power. That's not going to have any sort of change structurally whatsoever. What it's going to do, it's going to destabilize everything, give the Republicans more power, and also direct anger at elites into these like weird conspiracy theories. I don't know if you saw, but like just the other day before we recorded this, there were like hundreds of people at the spot where in Dallas where JFK was assassinated, and they were literally standing around waiting because they thought that JFK Jr., who last time I checked was not some right-wing Republican, was going to... Right.
JFK Jr.'s
not only
dead.
that, but he is dead. He was going to reappear suddenly and then, magically run off with Trump into the sunset to, enact the MAGA revolution. I mean, people literally believe this. But to get back to my point, I think on the other side of the aisle, the Democrats have been really good in recuperating, just like they did with Obama with the Occupy movement. They're really good at recuperating the talking points of certain movements. So, for instance, like look at what happened with Line 3. At the same time as you have Enbridge, which is a Canadian corporation, literally coming into the United States, working directly with the police, telling them what activists they want them to harass and repress, and then also the police filling out literally time cards with an oil corporation that is based in another country, and then saying like, yeah, well, we went after Timmy and, Jesus and Susie and all these people. Here's our time card. Here's the meals. Here's our gas. You pay for it. You buy us weapons. Literally, that's happening. Yep. But at the same time, they were working, quote unquote, with local indigenous people to basically create this like cultural easement to make it seem that they were also at the same time respecting, local people and local indigenous people in this project. So they had a counterinsurgency campaign on one side, and they had this like faux, respect the native people on their land on which of course a lot of people didn't buy at all. But it was this combined package. I mean, just like after the uprising, remember when the Democrats did their, the DNC convention, and they put like BLM in the background, and they did all this like, talking and like trying to basically use some of the language from the uprising. But of course, structurally speaking, they did nothing in order to enact legislation. They did nothing to basically curtail the power of the police. We still live in a country where over 3 people per day are being murdered by law enforcement. Nothing's changed. In fact, they doubled down and wanted to give more money to the police.
Well, and so let's look at the end result of that process, right? And I think that this is a point that hasn't been made often enough. The uprising last summer was a result of the failure of moderate Democratic policies. That after Mike Brown, they said, we don't need to cut police funding. We don't need to get rid of police. We need body cams. That's what we need body cam. Every Democratic mayor in the country lined up behind body cams. And the cops still murder people. And so people eventually got fed up enough that they rioted about it. And will do so again, hopefully. Right? The reality is that just because moderate Democrats can shove their politics down everyone else's throat with their corporate connections does not in any way mean that makes the problems go away. And so in all of these places, what you see, and this is endemic in Rust Belt cities, you see failed social structures, collapsed economies, run by moderate Democrats, and a really pissed off population, right? That's why the rioting in the Rust Belt last summer was so intense. And it took, whole National Guard units come in and just occupy whole cities there to really make that tamp down a bit. That doesn't make the anger go away, right? Just because you kill police reform doesn't make people not mad at cops, right? What it does is it gives the cops license to continue to act the way that they act, which then gets people angrier. And so traditionally in the Democratic Party, the response to that has been pushing progressive policies. But in the process of refusing to do that, right, like what progressive policies play a pressure valve role. We've talked about this with the New Deal, right? They eliminate the tension by giving people some, sort of moderate compromise that they're looking for, right? But when you foreclose that possibility, when you create a world in which all of us live these lives where really what we're supposed to do is hope that we get a job that we can work until the day we die, and that's the best we can hope for, when we are living in a world which is typified by counterinsurgency and surveillance and globalized warfare, when we're living in a world which is typified by, planetary heat death and, a bunch of politicians refusing to in any way either do anything or get out of the way. When you have that world, that is a world that lights itself on fire, hopefully, right? That is where we're going.
I saw recently that Greta came out and just said, I'm done with politicians and I have no hope in these people. Obviously that's one person and they have become kind of this symbol and a figurehead. But I do think that is emblematic in the way that a lot of people, especially young people, feel. And as someone, she very much represented sort of a moderate progressive wing of a lot of these movements. And I think that if that becomes kind of the de facto position, that essentially politics is this wasteland, spectacle-driven slogans that really mean nothing, that basically these people that are just managing the disaster and trying to keep people interested in this disaster show in front of them. I think we're in for some interesting times because that means that there's going to be even more space for those of us that have been saying this for a very long time.
So what's the takeaway from yesterday, right? And I think that this is really important to understand. The takeaway is not, oh my God, everyone bunker down, Trump world is coming back. That is what you hear in the media today. That is absolutely not what happened. What happened was a bunch of predictable results, and then a few other results which actually show that more radical approaches have a ton of support. And then a bunch of people that did not show up to vote for moderate Democrats because they offered them nothing. Right? We have to be incredibly, incredibly on guard against people who try and push to the center. We have to be incredibly on guard against people who say things like, your movement's failed because you didn't organize and run candidates and push policies. Nothing like that has ever succeeded in making the change that is necessary. It can't, because if the change that is necessary is that we need to have control and power over our own lives, we cannot get that from politicians. We can't get it through ballot initiatives. We can't get it from ballot box. That's never going to happen. That is what people are demanding. That is the trajectory of the last 20 years of political and social development, has been towards anti-capitalism and decentralization. It has not been towards neoliberal globalization, concentrating government power in the hands of the executive branch, and growing the military. Nobody is in any way inspired by any of those things, because it was those things that got us here. It was those policies that were enacted largely by Democrats. If you really look at the elections that have happened since 1992, Democrats have held office more than Republicans have. It is that period of time that we have really watched the security state grow. It's that period of time that we have watched American capitalism absolutely gut the lives of millions of people. And it's in that period of time that we have watched police violence escalate astronomically. Right? All of that happened under moderate Democrats, and then they wonder why nobody shows up to vote.
This has been the It's Going Down podcast. Check itsgoingdown.org for daily updates, columns, action reports, and news. Go to itsgoingdown.org/shop to support us, and follow us on all social media platforms. IGD, your daily resource for insurgent proletarian life.